Hey Team Bio, welcome to your screencast on Introduction to Phylogenetic Trees. I guess this is definitely connected to evolution and the diversity of life. So we're going to be talking today about how to read a phylogenetic tree or a simple tree of life, and then we're going to look at some more complicated trees and talk about the benefits and downsides of this type of a bunch of different schematics, I guess. Okay, but to start off, what is a phylogenetic tree? Well, it's a branching diagram that shows evolutionary relationships among different organisms, different species, or a higher order than species. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I'm sure you've heard of that classification scheme of life before. And a phylogenetic tree is just a way to look at relationships. And the branching could be genetic differences or it could be physical characteristics. But we're going to focus on genetic differences in our screencast here. Okay, so imagine this is a very simplified tree of life. The way we read the tree is we start at the root. This is, actually I'm going to pick a different color here. Rather than do it in black, I'm going to do it in blue. This is the origin of life. In our very simplified tree. So 4 billion years ago is this point. Life emerges out of the primordial soup. And as we move up the tree, we move forward in time. So this is time on this axis. So this is the origin of life 4 billion years ago, and then this is the present day at this point. Each of our letters, A, B, C, D, and E, represent a unique species, let's say. And every branching point is a speciation event. So at this point, hey Kevin, so this branch point here represents a point at which one species split and became two. And this dot here, right at the center of our speciation event, represents the last shared common ancestor. Okay. So if we're to look at our tree, we see here that there's a branching point shortly after the origin of all life, and E branched off from the rest of our organisms here. That means that E is equally related to A, B, C, and D. So they all share a common ancestor. This group shares a common ancestor with E back here. If we were to examine species A and B, we see that they're the most closely related species in our tree because they share the most recent common ancestor. But both A and B are equally related to C because the last shared common ancestor here is the same for all three of them. They're also equally related to D as they are to C. There are a couple different ways to draw this tree that give us the exact same set of relationships. So we could swap A and B here, if we wrote A here and B here, and this would be the exact same tree. Whereas if we put E over here and A over here, now this would be a different tree and it would be incorrect. But there are a couple different ways to draw this tree correctly. Okay, So that's how you read a simple phylogenetic tree. Down here, we have a slightly more complicated tree. I like this tree for a couple different reasons. Number one, it shows the origin of life right here as a blue dot. I think it's showing that life evolved in water. That's my interpretation. But there are a couple of reasons I don't like this tree, and I'll get to them later on. Okay, so I want you to make a couple big circles here. Let's take a gray pen and encircle all of this. And then take a black pen and encircle all of this. And I want you to label the black eukaryotic or eukaryotes. Remember from class today that these are things that have a nucleus. Okay, and in the gray, I want you to label this prokaryote. No nucleus. Only a nucleoid region. Okay, within prokaryotes, we have two, so these are our two kingdoms of life, or two domains of life, eukaryotes and prokaryotes. And then within those domains, we have a couple different kingdoms. So red circle here and an orange circle here. And I want you to label the red is bacteria. And the orange is archaea. Or, did I spell that right? 1 second. No, I forgot an A. Okay, it's spelled A-R-C-H-A-E-A. Archaea or archaea. Okay, so one of the reasons why I like this phylogenetic tree is because it shows an ancient event in which an ancient bacteria right here was engulfed by an ancient archaea, so part of this group right here. And that, it's called an endosymbiotic event. This endo meaning within, symbiotic meaning a close mutual relationship. This is a C. So when this ancient archaea engulfed this ancient bacteria, it gave rise to all multicellular or all eukaryotic life. Not all eukaryotic life is multicellular. So we all share a common ancestor when an archaea ingested a bacteria, and that bacteria became what is called the modern day mitochondria. Okay, so that endosymbiotic event was very important. It's the common ancestor of all eukaryotic life. Okay, within this grouping, I want you to do this in purple, and this, I guess, in brown, and this in blue, and this in green. Okay, and let's label this Plante. Let's label this Animalia. Let's label this Fungi. And let's label this Protista. Okay, so we have our different groups, our different kingdoms of life, plants, animals, fungi, and protists. These are all of our different eukaryotic life forms, but protists is actually a false grouping. I've shown it over here as one group, but know that I should actually circle some fungi over here and add them to my group, and some things that are more closely related to animals and add them to my group, and some things that are more closely related to plants and add them to my group, because protists, the grouping of protists doesn't actually, it's not a evolutionary grouping or genetic grouping. It's a physical characteristic grouping, and protists are all single cell or colonial. I don't know how to spell colonial. Let me look it up. Colonial. I'm a terrible speller. Okay. Colonial. Not multicellular. So, the common characteristic of all protists is that they are not multicellular, but the grouping of them was made before genetic sequencing. So ancient scientists in the 1800s were looking at microscopic life that was made of single cells or colonies. So a multicellular organism has differentiated tissue. Some of its tissue is going to be different from one another, whereas a colonial organism might be multiple cells, but they're all the same tissue type. So that's what differentiates colonial from multicellular. Colonial, all the same type of tissue. Multicellular, many different types of tissues. Okay, so some organisms that we currently classify as protists are actually more closely related to fungi. Some are more closely related to animals, and some are more closely related to plants. So it's not a true evolutionary grouping. Okay, so I like this schematic for a couple different reasons, as I've shared with you. I think it does a good job of showing the different domains of life and the different kingdoms within those domains. But the thing, and I love that it shows this endosymbiotic event. Also note that there is a secondary endosymbiotic event shown here when an ancient bacteria was engulfed by an ancient plant, and that became the modern day chloroplast. I'm going to change this to red. So this is a secondary endosymbiotic event, became the modern day chloroplast. Very cool. Okay, the reason that I don't like this tree is a few things. Number one, not all of the lines are the same size. I told you before that the length of the line represents time. Any line that peters out and doesn't make it to a present day should be showing an extinct species. So if you look at our tree here, it gives us the impression that archaea and bacteria are all extinct because the lines are not as long as those of our eukaryotes, and that's just not true. Also, the way that the tree is organized, it makes it seem like animals are like the pinnacle of evolution and the best. And that's also not true. I mean, all things are equally highly evolved. Some things are more complex than other things, but that does not, we've all been evolving for the exact same amount of time because we all share the same origin of life. So the fact that some branches are longer than the others, I don't like that either about this tree. Okay, the last tree is what we call an unrooted tree. Notice that there are a couple major differences. This is all bacteria. So what this tree here, bacteria were like kind of, so small and not super important, it seemed, on this tree here. Notice that they're the most diverse and biggest group on this unrooted tree. Okay, here we have all archaea. Again, archaea are a very large and diverse group of organisms. And then here, what was so big in this tree right here, this is all of eukaryotic life. In this third tree. And the reason why this tree is structured the way it is that this unrooted tree, which doesn't show the origin of life, in the axis, as we extend outward from the central node here, the length of these lines actually represents the difference in nucleotide sequence. So that's the difference in DNA sequence of all these organisms on the tree. So what that tells you is that bacteria are a very genetically diverse group of organisms, and all multicellular life here, so plants, animals, fungi, protists, we're all actually genetically very similar to one another, which is why we're grouped so closely together on this tree. So I like all three of these trees for different reasons. The first tree, it's easy to understand and start to get a sense of how you read a tree. The second tree is great because it shows this endosymbiotic event, but it also has some major downsides. And this third tree is very complicated and hard to kind of wrap your brain around, but I like the fact that it shows us that eukaryotic organisms, all things that we usually think of as the living things that populate Earth, are actually not a very diverse group. Bacteria, so much diverse and bigger than multicellular or nucleated life, I should say, not necessarily multicellular. Okay, that is all. See you in class on Monday or Tuesday.